Well, thanks a lot for staying with us here on Sunrise Live on E on this Thursday morning. Now, signing a contract is always kind of a bit of a tricky situation, whether you're signing a lease or buying a new car. Understanding what goes into the agreement in itself may not always be clear. So here to give us a little bit of an understanding in terms of the ins and outs of the contract and those dreaded fine prints, we've got in studio Vanessa Jacklin-Levin. She's a partner at BKM Attorneys. And of course, if you want to join in on our conversation this morning, if you've been caught off-handed or off guard by some form of contractual agreement and you're struggling to figure all things out, be sure to give us a call. Our number is 011 4471 742 or 2570. Alternatively, make use of our Facebook as well as our Twitter pages. Vanessa, thanks a lot for joining us in studio this morning. Now, it's a very interesting concept, you know, when we're looking at signing contracts or getting into a contract, etc. Let's speak a little bit about the elements of a binding contract. Exactly what constitutes as a binding contract?
So essentially, you need to have consensus. You need to have a meeting of minds about what the contract is involved by both parties. You also need to have capacity to contract. So one, for example, cannot contract with a minor unless a guardian also signs for that minor.
Okay.
And you cannot contract with somebody who has mental incapacity. So those are the essential requirements. There are other formalities for certain contracts, but not all contracts. For example, for the sale of your house, it's a sale of immovable property. That's subject to other legislation as well as those essential requirements. And that requires, for example, in terms of the Alienation of Land Act, that contract has to be written and it has to fulfill certain additional formalities to be binding.
Understandable. And then when we're looking at the way in which contracts have evolved over time, in the sense that from now the verbal contracts are now seen as actual contracts. So let's talk a little bit about the verbal contracts and how is it that I get into a verbal agreement of a sort, and even emails can actually be seen as a form of a contractual agreement. So just tell us about that.
So it regardless of whether a contract is oral or in writing, and regardless of what form of writing that contract is, if it's one document or a series of emails, the essential requirements are looked at. And if those requirements are met, it is a binding contract, regardless of its form. It's immaterial what the form of that contract is.
In other words, you're saying, Vanessa, dear so-and-so, this is to acknowledge that I will be taking up the job post that you've advertised, and then they say correct, and then they change their minds later on. That in itself is seen as a formal agreement.
As long as there's a meeting of minds, correct, and you can show that. But the difference essentially, when it comes to a written and an oral agreement, is the evidential issue. To prove, as soon as you have a dispute and you have one party saying one version of what the contract is and another party saying another, then it's an evidential issue. If you have a written contract, it's going to be easier to prove.
I'd like us to talk about, before we go into the terms and conditions, because let's be honest, as soon as you give in that 27 or 30-page document, you shut down at page 5, at least I shut down at page 5. So before we get into the fine prints in terms of what to look out for, in often cases, some individuals, whether entrepreneurs, startups are very guilty of this, or even those that do not necessarily know where to get the contractual agreement from and can't afford a lawyer. They download the contract from the website. Tell us about that. The templates itself.
The danger of that is most of the templates available on the website are in terms of laws from different countries, most often from America. And our laws are very, very different from those laws. So firstly, you're downloading a contract that isn't necessarily in compliance with our laws. Secondly, you don't understand half the time what you're downloading. And the most important step to take when entering into any contract is to fully understand what you're signing. So it's also to understand that a complex contract is not necessarily a good contract. A good contract is something that is simple, that is understandable, and that both parties understand when they're entering into that contract.
Preach, Vanessa, preach this morning when he speaks about contracts. Of course, we asked you on Facebook and Twitter as well to share your views with us this morning, and of course some of the questions that you may have regarding contractual agreements. I'm going to call in Mark. Mark, you want to join us just in the conversation to tell us exactly what people are saying?
Yes, very good morning to you.
Yes, morning.
Once we asked what questions do our viewers have with regards to signing a contract, and the first question, Daniel, I think he has got a question, 2 questions in fact. He says, what are the implications that one will experience working without signing a contract? And 2, what happens when you get a job and you are being pushed to sign a contract and work the same day without even reading the contract?
Vanessa?
Well, firstly, in respect to the first question, one can be employed without a written contract. There is still a binding contract because, as I said before, a contract can come into being in oral terms. There's also other variations. You can also enter into a contract by way of conduct and by implied terms.
What does that mean by way of conduct?
So the way a person behaves in a situation where they accept, where there's offer and acceptance and a meeting of minds, even if it's not expressly stated, but there is a meeting of minds, and then you for example, in the work situation, you accept the job, you turn up for work, you work. There is then a contract of employment that comes into being because of your conduct and because of the offer and acceptance and meeting of minds that has occurred. In respect to the second question, no one is entitled to force anyone to enter into a contract. If that happens, it's called duress, and you are entitled to rely on that duress to escape that contract. So you can have the contract overturned. Okay. So if there's a challenge on it and you say, I'm not bound by this contract, your defense is, I was forced to enter into this contract.
Sure.
Because there has to be consensus for the law to uphold a
just
contract.
Just expanding on what Mark has been asking, the question about duress and when to sign, etc. Many South Africans are in a situation where employment opportunities are far too few, right? So you show up for work, or they give you a contract to sign, they say, start now.
Yes.
You're so afraid, or you're even excited. What time frame is there, or even is there a set time frame to allow me to just go home, breathe, and look through the contract?
I think you are always entitled to ask for time to consider the agreement, to take it home, to read it through, to ask for advice if necessary. There are also law clinics out there that offer free advice, so it's not necessarily an expense that you have to pay to get legal advice on a contract. It is very important to understand what you are signing, and it is completely unreasonable for any employer to insist that you sign without reading and understanding what you are signing.
Sure.
So at the very minimum, you should be entitled to time to take it home, consider it, and come back the next morning.
Understood.
Okay. We've got a question from David. He's saying, I have a service contract with the stakeholder and they have not paid. The contract has a clause that automatically expires after a year. What must I do to hold them accountable for their part of the deal?
Well, he first of all must issue a letter saying you have not paid, this is the amount that is due, and give them an opportunity. Sometimes in contracts there will be a time period where a person has a further opportunity to fix what they haven't done. It's usually 5 days or 7 days, depending on what the agreement says. And if it doesn't say anything, just give them a reasonable opportunity to pay.
Yeah.
If they don't pay within that time, then you have the right to approach the courts for assistance in getting paid. If it's a small amount, and as a lay person, you can't do this if you're a company or a juristic person, but if you're a lay person, you can approach our small claims court to enforce small amounts on your own without the assistance of a lawyer. And otherwise, if you need an attorney, you can approach one of our other courts for assistance there.
Okay. Now, finally, Gaugelo saying, what are the implications of not signing a contract and you've been working for over a year for the same company?
You have a contract. You haven't signed it, but you have a contract because by way of your conduct and also oral terms, you've been working for a year, you have a contract.
So you pretty much, okay. Thank you. That's some of our comments on Facebook.
Thanks, Mark. Look, interesting sort of perspectives in terms of contracts themselves, but I want us to get into the fine prints now.
Yes.
As mentioned a little bit earlier, what am I supposed to be looking out for? A lot of times we're signing, but we don't know what we're signing. So the key elements now, what am I looking out for?
So the first thing is always try and look for any kind of penalty clause in a contract. So that when it comes to a situation where you may want to get out of that contract, you know what you're in for.
Sure.
Most contracts will have a provision that if you want to come out of that contract early before the fixed term comes to an end, there'll be some kind of penalty that you have to pay.
I want to pay attention to the penalty clause.
Yes.
Okay, what else?
The second is the duration of the agreement,
okay.
How long it is. Because if you are a lay person, a natural person, it's subject to the Consumer Protection Act, and it can't be longer than 24 months. If there is a longer term, for example, on a lease agreement, it's not binding if it's more than 10 years unless it's registered. So there are various provisions that apply depending on the duration of an agreement. So read the duration, ask questions about that duration, make sure that you can meet what your obligations are, terms of that agreement for that duration, for that period of time. For example, in an employment agreement, if it's an employment agreement for a fixed term of 2 years, but you know that you are going to go overseas to America in year 2, don't sign for 2 years. Explain that you can only commit to a year. Otherwise, you will be in breach.
Absolutely. And of course, there are various penalties and fines that actually come into that. So
Yes.
the penalties and fines for getting out of the contract now, very lastly, do I have to pay penalties? How does that work?
Yes, you do. If you've agreed in terms of an agreement to a penalty clause, you will need to pay penalties, but it's tested in terms of our law in respect to fairness and public policy.
Sure.
So where there's a situation, and there's also protection in terms of our Consumer Protection Act. So where there's a situation where those penalties are very unfair or unjust, there is a way that one can get that watered down.
Okay.
But if you've agreed to a penalty, that's why it's very important to understand that penalty.
So the
before
penalty
you commit
clause,
to
you must read it,
Yes.
as well as the duration of the contract,
contract.
as well as perhaps the remuneration, right? So you need to
The
know
remuneration,
the
the
remunerations,
amounts,
the amounts.
and your obligations,
duration.
what your obligations are, because that's read together with the duration.
Yeah.
Can you commit for this duration, this kind of obligation? Are you able to do what is required of you? Because if you aren't able to do what is required of you, then there will be consequences.
And
if you
you are
enter
in
into that agreement
breach.
and you breach.
There we go.
Correct.
Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank
Really
you so much, Faith.
informative conversation there. You
Thank
heard it,
you.
everybody. No downloading of contracts. But of course, speaking to Vanessa Jacklin-Levin, who's joining us in the studio, just giving us the fine prints of contracts. We're going to take a quick ad break now. Do stay with us because Mark Chase returns with the news shortly after this.
I also heard that, yes. I think I'll just go with your cue. We'll have a little bit more listen of that, yeah.